All right, imagine for a second that you're stepping right out of our modern world and straight into the visceral, unfiltered reality of a medieval European village. You can literally smell the sharp tang of wood smoke and roasting meat in the air. You can hear the heavy, rhythmic strike of the local blacksmith's hammer, and you can feel the damp, packed earth right beneath your feet. It's a world totally governed by the seasons, by absolutely back-breaking labor, and by a very acute, everyday awareness of human mortality. But today, we're going to explore this living, breathing civilization through a very specific, and honestly incredibly intimate lens: the human mouth. Welcome to this explainer of the fascinating, sometimes terrifying, and completely misunderstood history of medieval dentistry. We're going to reconstruct the everyday lives of ordinary people, uncovering exactly how they survived in a world where something as simple as a toothache could literally lead to madness or even death.
Okay, let's dive right into this. We kind of need to start by busting a massive modern myth. When most of us picture the Middle Ages, thanks to Hollywood and pop culture, we instantly envision this dark, backward time filled with plague-ridden peasants flashing universally decaying, blackened smiles. We just assume that because they didn't have modern toothbrushes, or fluoride, or even running water, their oral health must have been an absolute nightmare. But what if I told you that the average medieval peasant actually had significantly better teeth than you do?
Yeah, just 20%. Bioarchaeologists have meticulously examined tens of thousands of exhumed skeletons from medieval burial sites, and the historical consensus they've reached is genuinely shocking. Only about 20% of medieval teeth showed any sign of carious decay. Now, to put that into perspective, by the early 20th century, populations were showing decay on a staggering 90% of their teeth. Even today, with all of our advanced restorative dentistry, half of American teenagers have cavities. So the physical reality of medieval dentition completely upends our modern assumptions about the past.
Section 1. The medieval peasant's smile. So how did they pull this off? Well, to understand why their teeth were so surprisingly cavity-free, we have to look closely at their daily environment. The medieval peasant's smile was basically a product of both extreme protection and extreme destruction. On the one hand, you have their protective diet. They completely lacked the single greatest engine of tooth decay, refined sugar. It simply wasn't available to the masses. And without sugar to fuel acid-producing bacteria, well, cavities were naturally rare. They also consumed a lot of calcium-rich dairy, which really fortified their enamel. But on the other hand, their daily bread was a wildly destructive force. Grains back then were ground using massive stone millstones, and microscopic particles of rock and sand sheared right off into the flour. Imagine the intense, gritty crunch of eating stone-laced bread every single day of your entire life. Over decades, this relentless mechanical attrition basically ground away the deep crevices in their molars. So it prevented cavities, for sure, but it ultimately wore the enamel down right to the highly sensitive dentin, which led to severe pain and eventual tooth loss anyway. Moving on to Section 2, Terror of the Toothworm.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how people back then actually understood dental pain. When severe pain inevitably struck, how did the medieval mind conceptualize that agony? Remember, these folks had absolutely no knowledge of microscopic bacteria. From ancient Mesopotamia all the way to medieval Europe, humanity blamed a singular, insidious culprit: the toothworm. University-trained physicians who were steeped in ancient Galenic medicine believed that corrupt humor, specifically cold phlegm dripping from the brain, stagnated in the jaw. But for the ordinary peasant, the folklore of the toothworm made perfect, terrifying sense. They firmly believed a tiny living parasite had actually burrowed into the core of their tooth. When the worm thrashed and gnawed, you experienced blinding agony. And when it finally rested, the pain subsided. It was a very visceral, highly logical explanation for the throbbing, pulsating nature of a bad toothache.
So, picture this. How exactly do you fight a worm that's hiding inside your skull? Well, you try to smoke it out, of course. People resorted to some desperate, incredibly pungent remedies. A really famous treatment involves scattering highly poisonous henbane seeds over burning charcoal and then literally inhaling the thick narcotic smoke through a funnel directed right at the rotting tooth. The whole idea was to suffocate the worm so it would drop out of the mouth into a little basin of water. Other folks lit candles made of sheep suet and sea holly right next to their cheek, and if that didn't work, well, medical texts like the 14th century Rosa Anglica actually suggested applying the fat of a dead green tree frog or even partridge brains directly to the tooth. The hope was that the chemical reaction would make the rotting mass simply fall out. Absolutely wild, right?
But as you can probably guess, herbal poultices and frog fat often failed, and the pain remained. This quote by the Roman physician Celsus, whose medical texts were actually still heavily referenced during the Middle Ages, captures the timeless authority of this kind of suffering. Toothaches truly were numbered among the worst of tortures. When the agony just became too great to bear, when sleep was literally impossible and madness threatened, a medieval person really only had one option left. They had to walk into the loud, crowded public marketplace and face the blade.
Which brings us to Section 3, barber-surgeons and brutal blades.
And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer terror of the medieval marketplace. Meet the barber-surgeon, easily the most feared figure in the medical landscape of the time. Now, originally, monks performed medical procedures in monasteries, but in 1163, the Pope officially banned the clergy from shedding blood. So the monks literally handed their scalpels over to the guys who already had the sharpest tools and the steadiest hands, the local barbers. These men became the general practitioners of the Middle Ages. They handled everything from cutting hair and shaving beards to amputating limbs and pulling teeth. A trip to the barber-surgeon was, without exaggeration, a matter of life and death. For centuries, barbers just used generic flat iron pliers forged by local blacksmiths. But because they didn't fit the curve of a human tooth, they frequently just shattered the crown, leaving infected roots festering deep in the jaw. By the 14th century, they invented something called the pelican. This was a lever that hooked over the tooth and used the outside gum as a fulcrum. It literally levered the tooth sideways right out of your skull, which often crushed the gum and accidentally tore out perfectly healthy neighboring teeth in the process. Later on came the tooth key, which worked exactly like turning a door key. The barber would hook it on, twist violently, and wrench the tooth out, frequently fracturing the patient's jawbone right then and there.
Section 4. Dwell, a deadly slumber.
I want you to really put yourself in their shoes for a second. Imagine sitting in a hard wooden chair in a bustling public square, watching a man approach your mouth with iron levers, knowing for a fact you are going to feel every single second of it. To escape the immense psychological terror of the barber's tools, medieval healers developed a highly sophisticated yet incredibly dangerous botanical anesthetic called dwell. Now, this was not just a stiff drink. It was a highly precarious chemical cocktail with roots going all the way back to Viking and Roman times. It included opium poppy for profound pain relief, hemlock, which is a literal lethal neurotoxin, henbane to induce a twilight sleep and heavy hallucinations, plus wild lettuce, pig's bile, vinegar, and wine. These everyday healers were navigating a razor-thin line between putting a patient to sleep and killing them outright.
Let's move to how this actually worked in practice, because making this stuff was a massive gamble with mortality. According to surviving medieval manuscripts, healers would boil these highly poisonous botanicals together with animal bile, mix that toxic sludge into wine, and then have the patient sit by a warm fire, drinking it until they slipped into a deep, comatose state. Only then could the barber safely cut into them or wrench out a rotten tooth. And when the horrific surgery was finally over, the aftercare involved aggressively scrubbing the patient's temples and cheekbones with pungent vinegar and coarse salt, just to shock them back to consciousness. It was a terrifying, life-threatening risk, all just to avoid the unbearable pain of the pliers.
Section 5. The Elizabethan Sugar Rot. Now, as we fast forward a bit toward the end of the Middle Ages and into the Elizabethan era, a massive paradigm shift happens. The dawn of global trade brings a brand new, highly exotic luxury to the shores of Europe, a luxury that fundamentally upends human oral biology forever. I'm talking about sugar. At the time, sugar was incredibly rare and hideously expensive, which made it the ultimate status symbol for the nobility. They put it in absolutely everything: candied fruits, sweet meats, elaborate, intricate sugar sculptures, and the biological cost was devastating. Historical accounts of Queen Elizabeth I actually reveal her love of sugar was so extreme that her teeth rotted entirely. Visiting diplomats noted her blackened smile in their journals, and contemporary records show she literally had to stuff fine cloths into her mouth just to puff out her cheeks where her teeth had completely rotted away. Contrast the Queen's agonizing decay with the surprisingly healthy, cavity-free mouths of those poor, stone-bright-eating peasants we met earlier. It's a staggering difference.
So the crucial point here is how society actually reacted to this elite epidemic. And honestly, it is a fascinating, kind of twisted look at human vanity. Because only the immensely wealthy could afford the sugar that destroyed their mouths, severe tooth decay somehow transformed into a twisted, highly coveted symbol of high social status. It literally became a visual shorthand for success. In a display of profound, dark irony, members of the lower classes, whose teeth were naturally much healthier because they couldn't afford sugar, actually began taking soot, charcoal, and black wax to deliberately blacken their own healthy teeth, They did all of this just to project a false aura of aristocratic wealth.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? We've journeyed from the gritty, tooth-wearing bread of everyday peasants to the terrifying iron keys of the marketplace barber-surgeons, right up to the sugar-rotted smiles of royalty. Reconstructing this history shows us pretty clearly that every luxury carries a hidden, often physical cost. Which leaves us with a pretty provocative question to end on. If the ultimate symbol of wealth, sugar, quietly brought about the physical ruin of the elite's health centuries ago, what modern luxuries are quietly destroying us today?